David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, Chapter 36, Enthusiasm. I was not dispirited now. I was not afraid of the shabby coat, and had no yearnings after gallant greys. My whole manner of thinking of our late misfortune was changed. What I had to do was to show my aunt that her past goodness to me had not been thrown away on an insensible, ungrateful object. What I had to do was to turn the painful discipline of my younger days to account, by going to work with a resolute and steady heart. What I had to do was to take my woodsman's axe in my hand and clear my own way through the forest of difficulty by cutting down the trees until I came to Dora. And I went on at a mighty rate, as if it could be done by walking, when I found myself in the familiar Highgate Road, pursuing such a different errand from the old one of pleasure with which it was associated. It seemed as if a complete change had come on my whole life. But that did not discourage me. With the new life came new purpose, new intention. Great was the labor, priceless the reward. Dora was the reward, and Dora must be won. I got into such a transport that I felt quite sorry my coat was not a little shabby already. In this state, I went into a cottage that I saw was to let, and examined it narrowly, for I felt it necessary to be practical. It would do for me and Dora admirably, with a little front garden for Jip to run about in, and bark at the tradespeople through the railings, and a capital room upstairs for my aunt. I came out again, hotter and faster than ever, and dashed up to Highgate at such a rate that I was there an hour too early. As I approached the doctor's cottage, a pretty old place, I saw him walking in the garden, at the side, gaiters and all, as if he had never left off walking since the days of my pupilage. He looked at me thoughtfully for a few moments, evidently without thinking about me at all, and then his benevolent face expressed extraordinary pleasure, and he took me by both hands. "Why, my dear Copperfield," said the doctor, "you are a man! How do you do? I am delighted to see you, my dear Copperfield. How very much you have improved. You are quite—" "Yes, dear me." I hoped he was well, and Mrs. Strong, too. "Oh, dear, yes," said the doctor. "Annie's quite well, and she'll be delighted to see you. You were always her favourite. She said so last night when I showed her your letter." The doctor, walking up and down with his hand on my shoulder, and his kind face turned encouragingly to mine, went on. "Now, my dear Copperfield, in reference to this proposal of yours, it is very gratifying and agreeable to me, I am sure, but don't you think you could do better? You achieved distinction, you know, when you were with us. You are qualified for many good things." I urged my request strongly, reminding the doctor that I had already a profession. "Well, then, well," returned the doctor, "that's true. But, my good young friend, what's £70 a year?" "It doubles our income, Dr. Strong," said I. "Dear me," replied the doctor, "to think of that. Not that I meant to say it's rigidly limited to £70 a year, because I have always contemplated making any young friend I might thus employ a present too, undoubtedly," said the doctor, still walking me up and down with his hand on my shoulder. "I have always taken an annual present into account." "My dear tutor," said I, now really without any nonsense, "to whom I owe more obligations already than I can acknowledge—" "No, interposed the doctor, "pardon me. If you will take such time as I have, and that is my mornings and evenings, and can think it worth £70 a year, you will do me such a service I cannot express." "This will be so," said the doctor, clapping me on the shoulder and still keeping his hand there, as we still walked up and down. "And I shall be 20 times happier, sir," said I, with a little, I hope, innocent flattery, "if my employment is to be on the dictionary." The doctor stopped, smiling, clapped me on the shoulder again, and exclaimed with a triumph most delightful to behold, as if I had penetrated to the profoundest depths of moral sagacity. "My dear young friend, you have hit it. It is the dictionary." The doctor was quite happy in the prospect of our going to work together on that wonderful performance, and we settled to begin next morning at 7 o'clock. We were to work 2 hours every morning, and 2 or 3 hours every night, except on Saturdays, when I was to rest. On Sundays, of course, I was to rest also, and I considered these very easy terms. Our plans being thus arranged to our mutual satisfaction, the doctor took me into the house to present me to Mrs. Strong, whom we found in the doctor's new study, dusting his books, a freedom which he never permitted anybody else to take with those sacred favorites. They had postponed their breakfast on my account, and we sat down to table together. We had not been seated long when I saw an approaching arrival in Mrs. Strong's face. Before I heard any sound of it, a gentleman on horseback came to the gate, and leading his horse into the little court with the bridle over his arm, as if he were quite at home, tied him to a ring in the empty coach-house wall, and came into the breakfast parlour, whip in hand. "Mr. Jack," said the doctor, "Copperfield." Mr. Jack Maldon shook hands with me, but not very warmly, I believed, and with an air of languid patronage, at which I secretly took great umbrage. But his languor altogether was quite a wonderful sight, except when he addressed himself to his cousin Annie. "Have you breakfasted this morning, Mr. Jack?" said the doctor. "I hardly ever take breakfast, sir," he replied, with his head thrown back in an easy chair. "I find it bores me." "Is there any news today?" inquired the doctor. "Nothing at all, sir," replied Mr. Maldon. "There is an account about the people being hungry and discontented down in the north, but they are always being hungry and discontented somewhere." The doctor looked grave, as though he wished to change the subject. "There is no news at all. No news, they say, is good. Then there's no news at all, and no news, they say, is good news." "There's a long statement in the papers, sir, about a murder," observed Mr. Maldon. "But somebody is always being murdered, and I didn't read it." A display of indifference to the actions and passages of mankind was not supposed to be such a distinguished quality at that time, I think, as I have observed it to be considered sense. I have known it very fashionable indeed. I have seen it displayed with such success that I have encountered some fine ladies and gentlemen who might as well have been born caterpillars. Perhaps it impressed me the more then, because it was new to me, but it certainly did not tend to exalt my opinion of or strengthen my confidence in Mr. Jack Maldon. "I have come to inquire whether Annie would like to go to the opera tonight," said Mr. Maldon, turning to her. "It's the last good night there will be in this season. There's a singer there whom she really ought to hear. She is perfectly exquisite, besides which she is so charmingly ugly." Relapsing into languor, the doctor, ever pleased with what was likely to please his young wife, turned to her and said, "You must go, Annie, you must go." "I would rather not," she said to the doctor. "I prefer to remain at home. I would much rather remain at home." Without looking at her cousin, she then addressed me and asked me about Agnes, and whether she should see her, and whether she was not likely to come that day, and was so much disturbed that I wondered how even the doctor, buttering his toast, could be blind to what was so obvious. But he saw nothing. He told her good-naturedly that she was young and ought to be amused and entertained, and must not allow herself to be made dull by a dull old fellow. Moreover, he said, he wanted to hear her sing all the new singer songs to him, and how could she do that well unless she went? So the doctor persisted in making the engagement for her, and Mr. Jack Maldon was to come back for dinner. I was curious to find out next morning whether she had been. She had not, but had sent into London to put her cousin off, and had gone out in the afternoon to see Agnes, and had prevailed upon the doctor to go with her, and they had walked home by the fields. The doctor told me the evening being delightful. When I left at 9 o'clock, she was kneeling on the ground at the doctor's feet, putting on his shoes and gaiters for him. I was pretty busy now, up at 5 in the morning and home at 9 or 10 at night, but I had infinite satisfaction in being so closely engaged, and never walked slowly on any account, and felt enthusiastically that the more I tired myself, the more I was doing to deserve Dora. I had not revealed myself in my altered character to Dora yet, because she was coming to see Miss Mills in a few days, and I deferred all I had to tell her until then, merely informing her in my letters all our all our communications were secretly forwarded through Miss Mills, that I had much to tell her. In the meantime, I put myself on a short allowance of bear's grease, wholly abandoned scented soap and lavender water, and sold off 3 waistcoats at a prodigious sacrifice, being too luxurious for my stern career. Not satisfied with all these proceedings, but burning with impatience to do something more, I went to see Traddles. I took Mr. Dick with me because he had begun to fret and worry himself out of spite and appetite, as having nothing useful to do, seriously apprehending that his malady would increase. I made up my mind to try if Traddles could help us. The first subject on which I had to consult Traddles was this. I had heard that many men, distinguished in various pursuits, had begun life by reporting the debates in Parliament. Traddles, having mentioned newspapers to me as one of his hopes, I had put the 2 things together and told Traddles that I wished to know how I could qualify myself for this pursuit. Traddles now informed me that a perfect and entire command of the mystery of shorthand was about equal in difficulty to the mastery of 6 languages, and that it might perhaps be attained by dint of perseverance in the course of a few years. Traddles reasonably supposed that this would settle the business. "I'm very much obliged to you, my dear Traddles," said I. "I'll begin tomorrow." Traddles looked astonished, as well he might, but he had no notion as yet of my rapturous condition. "I'll buy a book," said I, "with a good scheme of this art in it. I'll work at it in the Commons, where I haven't half enough to do. I'll take down the speeches in our court for practice. Traddles, my dear fellow, I'll master it." "Dear me," said Traddles, opening his eyes. "I had no idea you were such a determined character, Copperfield." I don't know how he should have had, for it was new enough to me. I passed that off and brought Mr. Dick on the carpet. "You see," said Mr. Dick wistfully, "if I could exert myself, Mr. Traddles, if I could beat a drum or blow anything, poor fellow, I have little doubt he would have preferred such an employment in his heart to all others. Traddles would not have smiled for the world." Traddles, who would not have smiled for the world, replied composedly, But you are a very good penman, sir. You told me so, Copperfield." "Excellent," said I, and indeed he was. He wrote with extraordinary neatness. "Don't you think," said Traddles, "you could copy writings, sir, if I got them for you?" Mr. Dick looked doubtfully at me. Trotwood?" I shook my head. Mr. Dick shook his and sighed. "Tell him about the memorial," said Mr. Dick. I explained to Traddles that there was a difficulty in keeping King Charles I out of Mr. Dick's manuscripts. Mr. Dick, in the meanwhile, looking very deferential and seriously at Traddles and sucking his thumb. "But these writings, you know, that I speak of are already drawn up and finished," said Traddles after a little consideration. "Mr. Dick has nothing to do with them. Would that make a difference, Copperfield? At all events, wouldn't it be well to try?" This gave us a new hope, Traddles and I laying our heads together apart, while Mr. Dick anxiously watched us from his chair. We concocted a scheme, in virtue of which we got him to work next day with triumphant success. And we will pause there.